Let's talk about Iraq 20 years after the US invasion. In 2003, the US and a handful of allies invaded Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein on the premise that he had
weapons of mass destruction.
Well, that turned out not to be true, and the war kicked off a cycle of violence and political instability that Iraq is still caught up in.
I think the legacy is a destruction of a coherent state and the inability to rebuild.
So much has happened in the last 20 years, but we're going to focus on where Iraq stands today and how it got there. Here are 5 takeaways to help you understand it all. The first thing you need to know is that life in Iraq before the US invasion was really tough, and that the man who'd ruled Iraq for more than 20 years, Saddam Hussein, was brutal. There was no political freedom, and Saddam's regime committed horrific human rights abuses, killings, torture, disappearances, even a chemical weapons attack that killed thousands of Iraqi Kurds. Iraq was isolated, seen as a rogue state, and it was under strict international sanctions that had a punishing effect on the Iraqi people.
There was absolutely no room to barely even breathe. The regime dictates every aspect of your life, from the moment you're born to the moment of death.
But within weeks of the US invasion in 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime had fallen, and President George W. Bush announced, "Mission accomplished."
The United States and our allies have prevailed.
And despite the huge controversy around the invasion, there was a moment when some Iraqis thought things might actually improve.
Iraqis initially were excited about this idea, like, is democracy going to work? We don't like living under Saddam. Many Iraqis were actually cautiously looking at the invasion as a potential to end their, years of suffering under the Saddam Hussein regime and the sanctions and all that.
So then the question became, what happens next? And it soon became clear that there had been some seriously bad planning on that front. So that's our next takeaway, because it set Iraq on a really troubling and chaotic path.
Americans said, we are coming for you to give you a freedom. Where is the freedom? Bombing every day in the night. There is no administration, there is no system, there is no organization.
Certainly, U.S. leaders could have been more informed about the complexity of the situation that they were walking into.
The US installed a temporary government, the CPA, and the first thing it did was a big clear out of people from Iraq's state institutions. It was called de-Baathification, and it targeted anyone who'd been linked to Saddam's party, the Baath Party. But that was basically everyone who'd been running the country, because you had to be a party member for most state jobs. All the normal functions of government just stopped, and hundreds of thousands of people were suddenly out of a job. And then came the CPA's second move, disbanding the Iraqi military. And a lot of people reckon this was one of the biggest mistakes.
So a bunch of men with guns were now unemployed and angry. We began to see many different militias pop up, many different armed groups pop up. Many of them would become the networks that would become Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISIS.
The plan was basically dismantle everything, every aspect of the previous regime, all the institutions, and that led to a collapse in security that Iraq has barely recovered from.
Now, another example of the bad planning was how the new political system was designed and introduced. It was created by a bunch of outsiders, mostly American officials and exiled Iraqis, basically opponents of Saddam Hussein. Many of them had lived abroad for decades. Here they are at a conference in London 3 months before the invasion, where they agreed on what the new system would look like.
To me, the fundamental mistake was people came from outside to a country and determined that this would be the political system without really doing enough to get to the voice of the people and how the people wanted to be represented.
Now, in Iraq, the 3 main demographic groups are the Shia majority and the Sunni and Kurdish minorities. Under Saddam, Iraq was technically a secular state, but it was the Sunnis who generally held the positions of power. But the new political system was based on the idea that the three main groups should share power. There's an unofficial arrangement where the prime minister, who really runs the country, is always Shia, the president is Kurdish, and the speaker of parliament is Sunni. And that model served the interests of all those Iraqi exiles who designed it and planned to come back and take charge.
So how do you, returning to a country after decades of exile, build constituents? You don't know these people. You don't know any, the way you do it is by building these kind of imagined communities based on ethnicity or sect. All of a sudden, you have these parties come and they're now creating sectarianism and ethnic divides. And Iraqis are now beginning to find out from their friends, oh, I guess my friend is a Sunni, or I guess my friend is a Shia. It never really mattered before.
Now, the other problem with this new political system is that it's allowed corruption to flourish. It's a huge issue, and that's our third takeaway.
They call it power sharing, but to a huge extent, as one Iraqi politician herself called it, it's us basically splitting up the cake.
Most Iraqis basically see this political system as an elite pact of these parties that came to share the spoils of the state, to gut the system of its wealth.
The greatest threat to Iraq's advancement is internal corruption. The siphoning of state resources away from the benefit of the people into personal and private accounts for personal and private aims.
Keep in mind, there's actually a lot of money sloshing around in Iraq. It's got huge oil reserves, which bring in billions of dollars every year and basically fund the government. But it's mostly the politicians who benefit.
Their fortunes have increased by billions while the country continues to decline on the quality of life, on income, on levels of employment.
So the Ministry of Health has this board to make sure that medicine in Iraq is fit for purpose. Its budget is $1 billion a year. When we studied it, we found that over 70% of medicine is either fake or expired. So people are taking bad medicine, even though there is literally a company with $1 billion to insure medicine, right? Where does that money go? It goes to the political elite under the system of corruption.
Okay, the next takeaway, if you want to understand Iraq today, is how Iran fits in, because it's a big player. They're neighbors, and they share a long border. In 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, and the two countries fought an 8-year war.
I think from an Iranian perspective, they fear a strong Iraq, thinking largely back to the time of the Iran-Iraq War, and would seek, on one way or another, to co-opt Iraq such that it can never threaten Iran.
Remember, Iran is run by Shia religious leaders. It's got its own regional ambitions and a major rivalry with the US, which also plays out in Iraq. In the chaos that followed the US invasion, Iran started doing things like getting behind certain political parties and funding militias. And over time, it's become a major power broker.
Iran also does not function as simply a neighbor. It functions kind of as a protector and as an owner, basically.
Many of the opposition parties spent time in Iran when they were opposing the Saddam Hussein regime. So it leveraged these relations to really gain access to developing the political system in Iraq to its liking. It's that balancing of how to sort of keep Iraq strong enough to function, but also weak enough never to present a threat to its interests.
Okay, so from the flawed political system to corruption to the influence of Iran, what you've got in Iraq today is a kind of political stalemate where nothing really gets done. Add to that the issue of security, or more accurately, the lack of security. At the height of the chaos in 2008, around 10,000 civilians were killed. Iraqis have had to deal with all kinds of threats from foreign troops to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, plus all the different militias that have cropped up. Now, sometimes these militias have been helpful, for example, in the fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIL. But today it's got to the point where militias have a kind of stranglehold over Iraq and its politics, because many militias are actually aligned with political parties.
So there's no real ruling system in Iraq. It's a network of corruption. It's a network of parties and political figures and militia groups basically battling each other for money and influence.
And of course, none of this serves the needs of the people of Iraq, which brings us to our last big takeaway. Iraqis are desperate for change. In 2019, their frustration spilled over into huge protests in the south. The protests went on for months, and the government responded with a violent crackdown, and almost 600 people were killed.
They did bring down a prime minister, but they never really touched the system. And instead, the system has recalibrated.
Now, many in this protest movement have pinned their hopes on a guy named Muqtada al-Sadr. He's someone you should know about because he's a very powerful figure. He's a Shia religious leader who's been around for years. He led a brutal militia that carried out some of the worst sectarian violence that happened after the US invasion. More recently, he styled himself as a reformer, someone who wants to tackle corruption and curb sectarianism and the influence of Iran. But many question al-Sadr's real motivation, or even see him as an obstacle to reform. Al-Sadr's bloc actually won the most seats in the 2021 election, but he didn't manage to form a government. It led to a political crisis that essentially pitted al-Sadr against a rival Shia bloc that's more pro-Iran. Al-Sadr's supporters even stormed parliament. In the end, that other bloc came out on top, and they chose the current Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani. What all of this shows is just how difficult it seems to be for Iraq to move forward. The country was so deeply shattered by the US invasion, and 20 years later, it's still working out how to put the pieces back together.
Because we tend to blame America for everything. And yes, the United States does and should share the larger portion of the burden here for invading in the first place and then not planning for the aftermath. But also, Iraqis do share some of this burden. And by Iraqis, I do mean the officials and the leadership.
Check out our last episode on the Wagner Group. We've linked it here for you. But you can also find all our other Start Here videos on the YouTube playlist.